So, Mel, let me ask you this question then. So, when you talk about the value of connecting Autodesk to, whether it's PLM or procurement or ERP systems, obviously there's some significant value in that, and some of which we discussed today. And that is, you extend the user experience from, let's say, your ERP system to your Autodesk environment. You automate the process to save time. You have this central source of truth. And then we talked about this idea of data compliance, right? So, in other words, your product within Autodesk, you can manage all of those pieces so that by the time it gets to your ERP system, let's say, which for most organizations, that's your single source of truth, right? Or your centralized source of truth for most things. But it really helps you allow not only to design and build the product, but by the time that your item gets there or your BOM structure gets to your ERP system, you can check the box. It's correct. We had the right audits in place. It's compliant, so that by the time it does get to your item master in your ERP system, you can be pretty confident that whatever ends up there is what's supposed to be there.
Right.
But what can you tell our listeners about what tools does coolOrange use to facilitate that connection? But maybe if you would, Milt, think about this question more in terms of your implementation methodology, because I think that technically your product and the services that you provide and the products that you provide are pretty sound. But there's this other piece to it, and that is actual integration. That's the implementation process, right? So can you speak to our listeners, maybe how you folks go about that and what that might look like?
Absolutely. I mean, you hit on a good point there, right? So no two of these systems are ever exactly the same, right? Even if you're talking about the same target ERP system we're integrating with. They're all opinionated about certain things and don't care about others. And then everyone's implementation of their core systems like ERP and procurement and all reflects the way that they do business, right? Whether that's the way they manufacture things, the way they buy parts, or the way they take orders from customers, right? So handling the flow and the translation of sort of core design data to fit a specific implementation of, let's just take, shop floor scheduling, right? Requires that the actual translation between the two systems be flexible. And the design of that is not obvious. We can't lay down an absolutely standard handoff from a Autodesk Inventor bill of materials for a manufactured part and the version of that that's going to show up in someone's SAP Material Master, right? So the way we do this is, and we also, it's very difficult to even have the discussion about that with a customer in the abstract, right? Because, you either know one system or the other, and they're often newly implementing one of the two systems, whether it's the Vault side or the ERP side. So what we tend to do is we lay down a standard but not complete implementation in a test environment. And then we use agile methodologies, as I'm sure you're familiar with, to make small increments of the rest of what they need, feature by feature, data field by data field. And we do it in small blocks. And what we try to do is, first of all, we try to guide people to not make more customizations than is absolutely necessary, because, you have to own them for the rest of your life. But then the methodology is essentially, we make a small increment of functionality based on what they've seen and they know they need that's different. They test that out. We turn it around, they get a new update, install it, takes seconds usually. The customizations are fairly simple incrementally. And then queue up the next set. They try it. Sometimes this is a weekly cadence and it takes a few weeks to get enough 3, 4, 5, 6 blocks of changes to where they get to where now they understand, I see how this all fits together. Over in CAD, we call this that, and over here we call it, an item, and they correspond like this, and I need these 6 fields translated and these 2 fields concatenated to make the field that goes over there, and then I need a version number appended, little things like that are easily done in increments. But if you wanted to write the great big spec on day one, no one knows what they don't know. So it actually isn't possible. So we would never approach it that way. So we're sort of happy that, I don't know, whenever the Agile Manifesto was written, that those guys thought of that stuff, was like 12 years ago or something. I'm glad they did that, because I wouldn't survive this as an old waterfall style process. There's no way. We can't explain it. No one could scope it. All these projects would be a mess. And as it is, they're iterative, and at no point do you feel like you're that far from understanding what's going on, at least usually. So that's the approach. Classic Agile.
Yeah. Well, Mel, what would you say for most of your clients, the new clients that come to coolOrange, and of course, let's say they're using CAD or Autodesk, and of course they have an ERP system. What would you say is the biggest reason for reaching out to coolOrange? I mean, what is that pain point that finally just drives them over the edge and says, "Hey, we got to do something here"?
Yeah, they're sick of taking their bill of materials, exporting it to a spreadsheet, monkeying with a spreadsheet, exporting that, putting it in a shared folder to be consumed by their ERP system, and then 2 hours later getting back an error report or being told that it was put in a dead letter bin and they have to figure out what went wrong, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the semi-automatic manual shared folder integration style, that's sort of like the first thing everyone tries to do to connect these kind of systems, it's simply unsatisfactory, and it's a waste of time. It's neither efficient nor accurate, and people often have settled for that and worked that way for a long time. Or worse, they have someone whose job it is literally to have two screens for two applications open and cut and paste.
Yeah.
Which I mean, that sounds like there should be labor laws that don't allow you to do that to people. But you know, uh, when they see what can happen if we actually live with a bidirectional gateway integrate the two applications, and let each sort of team work in their own environment. No one doesn't want this. The
Yeah.
question is, do they
Yeah.
have the wherewithal to get it done, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's true, Mel. When you start talking about the value of this, right? Like the items that we've talked about today, like extending the end user experience, improved automation, central source of truth, data compliance, all these pieces that on the front end, you can make sure you kind of check all those boxes before it even gets to your item master and ERP is a significant
Absolutely.
benefit. And Mel,
Can I throw in one other thing?
yeah, yeah,
Sorry, there's another aspect of how customers come to us early in this that you're actually familiar with, right? From us working together. There's often a change point in the underlying infrastructure, whether it's the Autodesk side, right? So they've just moved on to this CAD environment. They're just deploying Vault, say, or just as commonly, they're either changing to a new ERP system, so they've got some 30-year-old thing or 20-something-year-old thing that that they limped through Y2K, and now they're
yeah,
finally changing, right? Or in like the context that you and I worked together before, there's an acquisition, a divestiture, a departmental reshuffling in a big global company where they need to harmonize these systems, whether it's on the sort of ERP side, right, or on the technical side. So, we do a lot of work with, you've got an entity that's made 25 acquisitions over 12 years, and the engineering departments have run semi-independently for a bunch of years. And they're finally saying, all right, this is crazy. We need to get some efficiency out of the fact that we have 12 engineering design teams around the world that could be working together better, right? And we integrated all their ERP data, in a Jack Nestell style project after the companies were acquired, but
yeah.
we never did get their engineering data fully pulled in and harmonized, right?
Mhm.
So that's an opportunity also to revisit the integration processes, but also maybe a chance to go through and clean up, reorganize, restructure some of that engineering data, which it can be a lot of work, but it can also yield some real value in terms of process efficiency, et cetera.
Yeah. And Mel, speaking of real value, what would you say after such an exercise? What would you say is the biggest metrics that demonstrates the real ROI, whether
Sure.
it's integrating the products together or just the data validation, take it as an opportunity to do some house cleaning? What are some
Right.
good metrics that organizations could use to say, "Hey, oh yeah, this is a real ROI here"?
Yeah, it depends on the sort of the style of design team, right? So in certain environments, you're interested in sort of your cycle time for design changes, right? So if it takes you as long to communicate the changes that the engineers want to make to a product that they design over to the shop floor, to procurement or whatever, as it takes for them to actually do the work, then clearly you can compress the cycle time simply by taking that tail end of the process and automating it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing. The other is so your same size design team, which is often a scarce resource, can simply get more done, right? Turn product changes, make new product designs. If you're a project-oriented manufacturer where things are sort of engineered to order, then it's actually could be the bottleneck in how many orders you can take. You make a complex engineered to order system, say conveyor systems for logistical operations or HVAC systems, for buildings or whatever. Those things are often complex engineered to order out of standard parts, and the rate at which you can turn the design around into a bill of materials that then gets handed to manufacturer affects how many orders you can take and affects the throughput of your entire, sales to, what do they call it? Order to cash process, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's one way of looking at it. The other is in more sort of stable product SKU environments. How often do you accidentally cause scrap or rework? Right. If you do a design change and because your communication of the changes is either disorderly or sort of haphazard, you're doing it manually and you could make a mistake. You forget to update one mold file that goes into a thing that gets sent out to procurement. Then you get the boat anchor coming back, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
If there's sort of different metrics there. The last I would say is that if you think about the environment of, say, these post-acquisition or divestiture things, how quickly can you get the new team up and working again, right? If they get to work on Tuesday after the acquisition closes and they realize, oh, wow, we're not in that domain anymore and I don't have my CAD files. How am I going to make a change to this design they just sent me, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's rarely that silly, but you've seen it can be a lot of work to get the engineering team back up and running with their tools and their data and their environment all nice and clean the way they had it, say, before a divestiture,
Yeah.
right? And so doing that well, planning for that as part of the whole, what you M&A guys call integration is also important,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, great insight there, Milt. I appreciate it. What would you say are some of the biggest challenges technically on, whether it's just an integrating, Autodesk with an ERP or with, like you said, getting after an acquisition, getting your engineering department reestablished in their own instance, right, in their own environment. So in either case, what would you say are some of the biggest challenges from a technical perspective?
Sure. Well, if you just think about what the kind of data we're talking about, right? First of all, engineering designs are locked up in large interconnected binary files that are obscure to anything except for the applications that write them. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
So you could add to that the fact that sometimes these files have been saved haphazardly, either in no system at all, say a shared drive, right, or strewn around people's own disks if it's really bad.
Mhm.
Or even they're in some system, but it's a system that doesn't go with an acquisition or a divestiture, right? So you now have potentially 20, 30, 40, 50 years of CAD designs, some of which were originally paper and were scanned, and some of which started in CAD, and some of which started in CAD that's a different CAD than you're using now. That corpus of data is complex, interconnected, sometimes old and broken, right?
Yeah.
And then now you want to beautifully cleanly integrate it with your ERP system so that bills of materials that you export are coherent and clean. So,
Yeah.
it's there's some heavy lifting in here no matter how smart your tools are,
Yeah.
right? There's some challenges right in there.
Well, obviously, Milt, that, to make systems work for businesses, regardless of what that system is, especially if you're going to integrate systems, I mean, that requires a fair amount. You have to address the people, the processes, and the technology piece of that equation, right? And
Absolutely.
what would you say are some of the biggest challenges in terms of implementation? What should organizations look for if they're looking forward to move forward with this? What are some of the biggest challenges they should look out for? Some of the biggest gotchas from an implementation perspective?
Sure. Well, one is not having a good understanding of your own processes, right? So underneath these systems, the data itself can be messy, but if your processes are clean, you can build scaffolding to compensate for that. So, my automation and guardrails next to my gateway there, right? So if we know very carefully what I want to communicate, say, between my design release process and my ERP system or my procurement system, then we can watch with code to say, sort of on the fly, hold on, the data you're about to try to push through isn't in good shape, right? And even if we can't fix it automatically with some of our little guardrail things, at the very least, we can just flag it and tell the human who's looking at it, okay, you got to clean this up before we pass it over. And that's not the end of the world, right? It's human beings doing design work anyway. So if they realize that they pulled some old file to start with that came from the previous system and doesn't have all the properties filled in, etc., okay, a human being can go back and fix that, so long as you're watching, because you know what's required to do the process correctly this time, right? So that's sort of one thing. The other thing that people can plan for, and this is when we're setting up these systems sort of in the first place, or when we're harmonizing, say, two systems that come from acquisitions, is that's a good time to take a look at your corpus of data and decide if there's some things that you want to try to fix now, or other things that you're just going to want to flag for if you ever need it later. So I'll give you an example. We often migrate a big bulk corpus of this data from, an old legacy PDM system that's being abandoned, maybe because a larger company acquired a small company, and they're not going to use the system that the little company used because it's end of lifed by its vendor, or it's just different from what they use. So we extract all the data and we're going to load it into the parent company's, hopefully a vault. When we do that, there could be, of the, I don't know, let's say 1.8 million CAD files we're going to bring over, only 5% of those are actively in use now, and the rest are historical versions or versions of data from files that are products that they don't ship anymore or whatever. Now, we're not going to go through manually and even decide, right?
Yeah.
So the trick is to do a little bit of analysis of that data, bring it, maybe we even bring it all over, but we just mark it all and say, the next person who checks this out, which implies it is something you care about, right then we'll throw up a little flag that says, okay, we didn't clean this up. You have to, right? I sometimes refer to that as the Pottery Barn rule, right? You broke it, you bought it, right? And you can do that with CAD data. You can say, hey, look, we're not going to try to fix all this because most of it we probably don't need or we'll never see again. But when we do, we're not going to try to make some really smart software that figures out how to fix it. We'll just tell you, make sure you fix it. And by the way, then we have those guardrails that won't let you push it through the process until it's correct.
Yeah.
Right? And that's all we do is we make sure we have the gates on there. Did that answer the question? I think
that did. Yeah. Thank you, Mel. And, so obviously you folks at coolOrange, it's technology. I mean, obviously providing that technical solution, but, it's also about the implementation. And, to your point there, it's almost contextual, right? As far as your implementation, and maybe sometimes a bit of an art in the way that you approach, such a data migration. And and I've seen it in action with you and your team, and I know you do a great job with this. But yeah, to a certain degree, it's really kind of taking that step back and really understanding your strategy and why, making sure people are aligned, making sure that they understand your approach and the best way to go about such a data migration or integration.
Sure. Well, it's not entirely different from the activities you have to go through when designing, a new ERP system for someone like you do, right? The idea is you have to understand what they're trying to accomplish. You won't maybe understand it in the level of detail that they do if they're the people who are going to live it, but you have to understand well enough to translate that into the data and the processes that are implemented by the system. In our case, the vault, right? In our case, maybe RP or whatever, right? Just well enough that you can put that in place for them, then they can see it concrete